Transformers, a classic cartoon, movie, and video game franchise that exploded in the 80s and 90s, making it a household name for generations. I mean, who the hell doesn't know the Transformers?
Optimus Prime? He's Jewish?
When I mention the Transformers, I'm betting you're thinking of one of two things, either the original cartoons or the movies. But the franchise has so many scrap series and reboots, they almost feel like totally disconnected franchises. There are the original Transformers cartoons, the many weird and strange reboot cartoons through the 90s, the entirety of the Michael Bay movies which aren't even done yet, and then the modern era of cartoons. Ever since the original Generation 1 era of the Transformers, the series has never really found its footing in any one style. I mean, Armada lasted maybe 2 years, there was Transformers Energon, Transformers Animated, Transformers Prime, just so many confused series. But by far the most overlooked element in the Transformers franchise are the many video games they produced throughout the years. Some of these are absolutely terrible, and others legitimately earn a spot amongst my favorite games ever made. But please join me, ladies and gentlemen, through our journey through every Transformers game ever made. Chapter 1. Playing through the horseshit games to get to the good ones. We start our extremely long journey in 1986 with the first ever Transformers video game ever released, but before we hop into these, let me explain some things about the video before I forget. Firstly, many of these games were unavailable to me. I'll address these as they come, but some of these were either removed from the stores or just absurdly overpriced. I did find some workarounds by borrowing some footage that I could find, and others are just footage from trailers I managed to dig up. The second issue here is that a few of these games, especially the earlier ones, were Japanese exclusives, which made an immediate issue for me, because this shit might as well be written in wingdings for me. Transformers was actually just as big in Japan as it was in the States, so there are a handful of these games that I was just completely blind through. So if I A, horribly mispronounce, or B, don't experience a game fully, it's probably because of that. Transformers! The Commodore 64, released all the way back in 1982, and it's a very odd point in gaming history. This predates the NES by a good 3 years, and people at this point didn't really know how to properly get a gaming console into people's homes very efficiently. There were a few major consoles at the time, like say the Atari 2600 or 5200, but the popularity of home consoles hadn't really occurred yet. The result of this is the bastard child called the Commodore 64, or C64 for short. It's a console that's essentially a home computer with a keyboard and mouse and a joystick that you can buy and play games on. Overall, a relatively innovative idea, however, it's quite outdated. But to my surprise at the time, this was actually a very successful console, selling over 30 million units at the price of $600 a piece, making it technically the highest selling model of any computer ever, which is actually kind of cool. But we're here for a Transformers game, not a history lesson, so let's hop into it with the first two games we have to deal with. Transformers! The first one is called Transformers Ocean, and it's essentially a 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up. If you've seen my video games made by musicians video, it's pretty similar to the Michael Jackson video game that he made. Now unfortunately, I immediately ran into the most prominent issue with this console. The keybinds are not clear or defined in emulation whatsoever. I was essentially just blindly figuring out what the fuck any of the keybinds did because the game does not tell you at all. I tried to figure this out by looking up an official C64 keyboard, but just look at this abomination. This is an absolute train wreck. They literally saw the wingdings language on Google Docs and thought, damn, we gotta add that shit. So my only other alternative was to turn to the manuals that came with these games, and unfortunately I could only come across one of these, and it was for the second game we'll get into in a minute. But unfortunately with this first game, I really couldn't play it because I did not know what the fuck was going on. But let's talk about the sequel. Instead of opting for a beat 'em up, the sequel, Transformers Battle to Save Earth, instead opts for a strategy game styled approach. Now unfortunately this game was also a massive struggle to wrap my head around, but after reading the manual I at least got to play it a little bit. We start with 8 different Transformers that we send to different locations to prepare for a Decepticon attack. We can go to the view screen by selecting a Transformer and holding V, which if the Decepticons are present, initiate the game's combat, which assume is supposed to be kind of a shooter judging by the crosshair, but once again I really couldn't get this shit to work. So unfortunately I didn't spend a whole lot of time with these games, but we got a lot more to go, so no regrets. Let's move on to the NES title. Transformers Mystery of the Convoy, a Japanese exclusive title, and unfortunately for me, this was made in the era where most Japanese developers thought that they should make difficult games but gatekeep them from Western audiences. However, this game is some total horseshit and is probably one of the worst games on this list. And not because it's hard, don't get it twisted, difficulty is what makes a lot of games very satisfying. But there's a fine line of a game that's difficult and fair, and then there's difficulty for the sake of difficulty, and that's exactly what this game is. There are these Decepticon jets that fly at you and your bullets just don't ever connect, meaning you can't fight back. You either need to sprint through these or jump back and dodge. Both are very risky. There's a transform mechanic in the game that helps you get through the jets, but literally just the jets, because once you go over them, you can barely deal with the tanks you see right after. And the cannon hitbox is only active at the very end, making it fucking useless. Also, for some stupid reason, NES games just intentionally try to give you an epileptic episode whenever you try and start them. Jesus Christ. Transformers! Now unfortunately, I have to hit you with some cold water and admit something. This is the first game that I could not play. I found some footage on this, but it's not mine, and I really don't have strong opinions on this game. Released in 1987, the game took inspiration from both side-scrollers and the genre that came to be known as bullet hell. This game came out on the Nintendo Famicom Disk System, whatever the fuck that thing is, and once again, this just seems like the stereotypical licensed video game cash grab, so let's talk about those for a minute. All of these early era video games are almost fucking horrible and have nothing to do with the Transformers whatsoever. Most licensed games have a really bad reputation for just being cash grabs, and this unfortunately suffers the same fate. The Generation 1 Transformers are a lot of people's favorites, but for some reason they never once made a decent game until way later in the series. But our next game came out in 1998, an 11-year time gap in titles, and it's at this point the original Transformers series was completely over, including Generation 2 and the few other minor attempts to revive the series after that. And at that point, many people considered the Transformers franchise to be completely dead. But then miraculously, a new series emerged to save the franchise. Transformers! Beast Wars Transformers. I mean, the idea is fucking genius. Cars are pretty cool, but now we're out of ideas, so what else are kids interested in? Holy shit. Now, me personally, I really don't like the Beast Wars very much because 3D animation in the 90s is so unbelievably cursed. And actually, I almost forgot, but technically the movies just now got into the Beast War eras of shit, and I've heard it's completely awful. This game is an absolutely cursed third-person shooter, kind of like Doom in a lot of ways, in the way that you search for objectives to unlock gates and progress through the levels, but with the unique mechanic of being able to transform into different animals with the choosable characters. And the next few games are going to have this issue, but I cannot stand the fucking faction names. The Autobots and Decepticons got changed to the Maximals and the Predacons. I don't know what it is about the word Predacons, but it makes me violently uncomfortable and definitely implies you're a sex offender. Now, I chose to play as the gorilla at first because, I mean, who the fuck wouldn't, man? And my first impressions on this game were rough, to say the least. For starters, the black skybox makes this game feel super depressing. It could really use a whole lot of color, and look at how weird the lock-on shit is. It fully pulls your camera up and snaps back, making it super jittery. The result of this means a presentation nightmare, and I'm gonna be honest, the core components here aren't really bad at all. I mean, it's just third-person Doom as a gorilla. It's just something that's annoying to play to an extent, and I did my best to speedrun through this level as a cheetah and got bored and killed myself, so anyway, moving on. Transformers Beast Wars Transmetals. The second Beast Wars adaptation, and for some stupid reason they decided to switch over to a fighting game format. But somewhere along the way, the developers must have had a carbon monoxide leak in the office, because this is potentially the least sensically designed fighting game I've ever seen. We either get to choose to play as the Maximals or the Predacons, and to my surprise there aren't any Minecraft YouTubers here. Megatron, who's a fucking T-Rex, six his goons onto the Maximals, and we have to take all four of them out before we lose all of our fighters. It's essentially a 4v4 elimination match, but the problems come into view the second you start the game. The camera angle is such dog shit, it's impressive. And to my delight, in a fucking fighting game, there's no move list. I don't know who the fuck keeps doing this. Just add a fucking move list. It's not that hard. I don't even know if there's a block mechanic here, because no matter what button I use, these goddamn homing missiles just shred my HP. I went at this first fight for a good 20 minutes, and I couldn't even beat it. But considering that IGN gave this a 3 out of 10, I don't even feel bad giving up right now, because this next game is miles better. Transformers. The direct sequel to that fighting game came out on the Game Boy Color, and whoever the fuck was in charge of the marketing needs to be fired immediately. They went from Beast Wars Transmetals to... In English, this is as follows. Divisive Duel, Transformers Beast Wars Divisive Battle. Yeah, most games these days stick with a two-syllable title for a reason. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I don't read or speak Japanese, and these menus look like fucking hieroglyphics, so I just kinda started mashing start, and shit started working. Now, picking a character was a little tough because I don't know who the fuck anyone is, but I chose a tank because, I mean, it's a fucking tank. What do you want from me? And to my surprise, this is actually a functioning video game. We have a punch and a kick button, and holding either of these results in a heavier attack. Of course, directional inputs are a thing here too, making for some super interesting attacks and utility. But of course, what makes these games so special are the transforms. By hitting the select button, we transform our character, and it completely changes the way you approach the game. Characters like Megatron have an extremely strong rushdown style of gameplay, while my character, Tank Tor, goes from a strong grappling and pressure playstyle to a defensive powerhouse with reduced damage and amazing anti-air. Overall, each character feels extremely fresh and unique, and if brought back, could be an extremely unique gimmick for a new fighting game today. While I find the combo system lacking alongside the lack of an obvious guard animation, this is actually the first good video game a whopping 6 minutes in. Transformers! Transformers 2003, yet another Japanese-only release, and it's the only game on here I'm not even sure is real. The only shit I found on this game is a collection of cutscenes in English, which really doesn't make a whole lot of sense for a Japanese-exclusive title. So either Wikipedia's lying to me, or this is literally just the game. I don't fucking know, don't blame me. Chapter 2, a random decent video game. What if I told you that there's a video game you've probably never even heard of that is genuinely miles above anything I have showed you so far, with difficult bosses like the Soul series, extremely customizable and creative weapons like an RPG, and pseudo-open world environments with choosable characters? That, my friends, is the game simply titled Transformers that released on the PS2 all the way back in 2004. This is unironically in my top 15 games of all time, and I don't give a singular fuck about the fact that this game barely has any reviews above an 8 out of 10, but this is an almost flawless game. But I'm getting ahead of myself. There's a secondary title to this game, which is Transformers Prelude to Armada, which gets us back into the history of the actual TV series. Transformers Armada aired in 2002 to 2003 and featured a return to form from Beast Wars. However, there are some serious fucking redesigns and character swaps. Optimus Prime looks pretty fucking normal here actually, but Megatron not so much. I know his design is almost always changing with every iteration of the series, but what the fuck happened here? Don't get me wrong, it's a cool design, but he rarely ever speaks in this version. And the spiteful, shit-talking old-school Megatron just isn't here. However, he is tall as shit. Now, most depressingly, Bumblebee just straight up got scrapped and replaced with the very talkative Hotshot. They're kinda just the same character. I mean, for years I straight up thought this was Bumblebee, to be completely honest with you. Starscream makes his best appearance yet with a far less whiny voice actor and a very intimidating demeanor. But that's enough stage setting. Let's hop into the story here with our intro cutscene taking place on the planet Cybertron. A massive Decepticon invasion appears to have taken place that is an absolute success, with the Decepticon army flooding the streets and Optimus is getting his ass kicked. That is, until the game's entire gimmick comes into play. The Minicons, a subset of Transformers, send a distress signal that separates the two. Seeing the Minicons crash into Earth is a compelling enough reason to completely stop attacking Cybertron, despite the fact that he basically won the war. For some stupid reason he doesn't kill Optimus, something he planned on doing not 10 seconds ago. God damn it, I hate this trope. But what's so special about the Minicons in general? Well, in the show they provide a special and unique support ability to a Transformer with the power links, resulting in a substantial power increase. We'll see how they function in the game here in a minute, but for now let me explain the fundamentals of this game. We choose our character between Optimus, who focuses on offense, Hotshot, who prioritizes speed over anything else, and Red Alert, who takes the defensive approach. Now, I've always personally played as Optimus through the entire game because it just feels really weird not to. No idea why, it just feels wrong. Once we've decided on our character, we need to select our deploy location, something we continue to unlock by playing the game's 6 different locations. Our first major area is the Amazon rainforest, and this is a magnificent animation for 2004. The character detail, the lighting, it's all super dope. But finally we get into our gameplay, and yes, I know this is very PS2, but that's not even half of it. I actually wanted to make a video dedicated to just this game way earlier on in my channel, but I never really could because this game's graphics on an emulator used to be horrible, like almost unplayable. But the most powerful PS2 emulators' recent updates have made this game go from this to this, and I think it's fine now. But let me show you what this looked like on PS2. Yeah, I'm sure for the time it was okay, but this is rough today. Let me switch it back. Oh, what the fuck is that? Yeah, for some depressing ass reason, there's a tiny strip of graphical corruption when upscaling the game, which is so sad. It left me in a very unfortunate position. Should I A, put the game back in less than 720p and keep everything native, or do I B, get my hands dirty, upscale the game a tiny bit, and zoom in just a little bit at the cost of proper FOV? I'm sure it's gonna end up super weird at certain points, and if there's something that needs zoomed out, you're just gonna have to look at this hideous bar like I did. I'm sorry, but I think the game looks miles better. But regardless, let's get into the introduction of the game, and outside of Red Alert spam calling you, just kind of being an annoying dick throughout the game, this is solid. The movement, while smooth, still feels kind of robotic in a way, and the sound design of your movements really supports this perfectly. And being a Transformers game, by pressing triangle, we can turn into our vehicle form and commit vehicular manslaughter as much as we want. And you might be wondering what the glowing yellow auras are. Those are Minicon locations that we need to go and collect. And what do these Minicons do for us? Well, they become available to equip. And let me quickly explain this entire system. Each Minicon falls into one of our 4 weapon slots, one bound to each shoulder button. R1 is your light weapon slot, R2 is for your heavy weaponry like rockets and snipers, L2 tends to be defensive utility either from a shield or like an enhanced dash, and L1 is assigned to your passive abilities because you're going to be using this button to jump. Each Minicon also has an assigned color: red, yellow, purple, blue, and green. Having multiple Minicons of the same color creates synergy and grants you additional health on top of your health bar. And finally, each Minicon has a certain amount of power it takes up of your 10 slots, meaning certain powerful Minicons like Aftershock are extremely hard to work into a build. I hope everything's starting to make sense. This is a very creative system that prompts you to constantly have to reevaluate your build when you find a specific type of Minicon. Overall, fantastic. The levels themselves consist of you using your various methods to traverse the terrain, and then finally finding each level's respective boss once you're up for the challenge. Each boss offers a unique challenge, some being far easier than others. Our first one is the heavy unit, which more than anything else is a tutorial fight. You need to use your defensive measures like shields against blaster fire, but that won't work against a missile, so we need to dodge those. But overall, he goes down pretty easy. That is, if you have a fair fight. You see these assholes? These stupid fucking things are never mentioned once by name, but make no mistake, they're making their way into my suicide note at record pace. These things will shoot you at ungodly range, and after a few attacks, it charges up this massive beam that just ragdolls your character, sending you flying. This actually scared the shit out of me a few times as I occasionally play this without headsets. The problem though is that they don't hesitate to interfere even in a boss fight, meaning that this is hardly a one-on-one. But if you manage to get him in a corner, he goes down pretty quick. Beating him unlocks our personal minicons and the power link system. The companion minicons stick by your side and fight in combat, but by pressing square we enter power links mode, which slows down time around us for a bit, allowing for high damage output. The caveat of this being that it actively drains your HP, making it not really worth it in the long run. And realistically, that's the entire gameplay loop in a nutshell. And from here on, the entire game is basically just built around these boss fights. For starters, there's Starscream with one of the coolest intros in any game ever. His boss fight kicked my ass as a kid. His sword form is fairly easy to deal with, but when he turns into a jet, he's gonna fly around pretty damn quick. And the second you lose sight of him, it's a consistent panic as you know a carpet bombing is about to happen. There's Cyclonus, who hits you with a giant swing from Tekken and throws you off a pyramid, but none of these can compare to the genuine Dark Souls level difficulty boss fight. No exaggeration. This is Tidal Wave, the 14-story tall Decepticon that turns into an aircraft carrier, and the game went all out on making the Colossus into an actual boss fight. Before I rip into the boss fight too much though, I have to take a minute to talk about the presentation. I mean, are you kidding me? This guy is 40 times bigger than you are. And I know Shadow of the Colossus did some similar stuff, but they didn't walk around the deep Atlantic shooting mortars at you, did they? This is some Attack on Titan shit. However, unfortunately, they failed to make this a good boss fight at almost every turn. Tidal Wave slowly makes his way towards you, stopping to barrage you with energon bolts and mortar fire for the first half of the fight, and every single spot on his body takes 0 damage except for his head. But considering how fucking tall he is, there is almost 0 weapons that you have that can reach that far. Meaning one thing, you're forced to equip the sniper minicon that you may have missed. And even still, he almost doubles your range. It's so stupid. But this isn't even the start of it. About halfway through the boss fight, he brings out a laser attack with 3 AoE lasers he'll drag around randomly. And these not only have twice the speed that you do, but it can also melt through your entire health bar. And on top of that, once he gets super low, he sends out infinitely respawning enemies to seal your fate. I unironically was stuck on this boss fight as a kid for fucking weeks, trying every single strategy you could possibly think of. And what's even more funny to me is that the follow-up bosses like Starscream, who tries to kamikaze you, and Megatron, who has the most bullshit grabs ever, aren't even half as difficult as this. This is a horseshit, awful, poverty design of a boss fight that is the only blemish on what is a truly almost flawless open world shooter for the PS2. Go play this game. Chapter 3. The Michael Bay Era. Being the insanely successful franchise the Transformers had become through the 80s and 90s, it was finally time to make a move from the cartoon scene to movie theaters, and in 2007 we officially entered the Michael Bay era of Transformers. The Transformers movies are very, very different from any of the cartoons and just make some of the most baffling decisions ever. Bumblebee is mute for whatever fucking reason, Soundwave talks normally and isn't a tape recorder, which is so stupid. Worst of all, Megan Fox is here. So there were some rough choices made, but one part of this that always gets way too much hate is Megatron. It's not really quite the same as the originals, but I think it's a fine enough way to change the formula. A lot of people shit on these films for being a very boring snooze fest, but I don't think that at all. People just don't want to sit through 10 minutes of build-up. However, my issue with these movies is how poorly shot they are. Watch this fight scene with me, yeah? Look at the cool exchange of blows that's obscured by the camera angle, but then it just cuts to Sam, who's just mouth-breathing in the corner for 5 seconds. It's such a waste of time. But not 10 days after the movie released, the Transformers video game was released on PS2. So yeah, Transformers the video game. The first game on here that barely has anything to do with the movie and puts in the bare minimum effort. We get to pick our side, and cause I'm a little edgelord, I'm gonna side with the Decepticons here. We start out watching our character Blackout make his way through the desert towards a military base, just like he does in the movie. This desert is our first hub world, so to speak. We start our missions by walking into these green circles and getting briefed by Megatron. And unfortunately, this game is absolute horseshit from this point forward. The combat in this game is literally 4 options. Stand and shoot, transform and shoot, try to melee, or throw random shit. It's incredibly boring and makes up about 90% of the game. Coming off of the heels of Prelude to Armada, this is a major step down and once again converted the entire series to a cheap attempt at a cash grab. The UI in this game is miserable, and the game does an extremely poor job at telling you what it actually wants you to do. And it actually expects you to fully read the fucking wall of text at the beginning of every mission that isn't voiced, and it's just kind of ass. But let's see what's going on the Autobot side. We start off the game as Bumblebee in suburban America, and it's the exact same boring, repetitive combat in flat areas with no color, no interesting mechanics, nothing at all. We do have a little bit of story progression here, with Sam being hunted down by the Decepticons and us needing to keep him safe, just like the movies. But once again, it's just so unbelievably mid. And you know where I absolutely couldn't keep going? Right here during the game's first boss fight. Once we whip Barricade's ass, we race off to Sam's location, but Barricade's right here. Why don't we just fight him? Why does he just give up? And how does he still get there first? What the fuck? Transformers the game, but but for DS. This is the first in a long set of games where instead of just having 2 campaigns in one game, they just decided to release them as 2 separate games, Transformers Autobots and Transformers Decepticons. The first game I played was the Autobot version, so let's hop into this. For starters, it reuses the intro cutscene from the PS2 game, and the UI is almost completely identical, but to my surprise, as much as I expected these games to be horrible, I was pleasantly surprised. We start off the game by choosing to name our Autobot, and my maturity manages to show through as always. And yeah, I said our Autobot. We can name them and later into the game choose the vehicle we get to transform into. And oh, holy shit, listen to this. There's fucking dialogue. Why does the DS game released in the exact same year have dialogue and the PS2 game doesn't? Whatever. In all seriousness, I genuinely prefer this version of the PS2 game by a long shot. Any vehicle you see can be scanned and unlocked to be transformed into, and the game has a public order system to make sure you're not just blowing up random shit all the time. Because once you hit 3 stars, just like it's GTA, you get swarmed by cops and it's damn hard to get away. But let's talk the story missions. Most of these revolve around scanning something for some reason, but more importantly, they all involve an amount of combat. And this is where the DS version struggles immensely. Your camera moves with the L and R buttons, but it rarely works the way you think it does, meaning trying to keep an enemy in your sights can be very difficult. But the combat isn't incredibly frequent within these missions, but it's enough to be noticeable. But let's check out the Decepticon version of the game, shall we? It's the exact same game. It's completely identical. You just talk to Megatron. That's the only difference. It's the same game.
No, you're not, Griffin. I'm giving it to Soundwave.
So I can just put my stuff anywhere? My wife Denise, we met in a Christian chat room.
Oh boy, our first mobile game of the list, and man, this game starts a bad trend. This is a 2D platformer brawler thing that has no idea what the fuck it actually wants to do. Due to some compiler bullshit that happened a very long time ago, I can't play this anymore, so here's a synopsis. This is a very confused platformer that wants to do Transformers things, but also very generic beat 'em up things, but the problem is that the stage doesn't account for this very well, so the vehicle mode might as well not even be in the game. So overall, no regrets on missing out on this game. Moving on. Transformers Animated. Our first return to the cartoon style, something you'll see frequently here. And this one's based off the 2008 Transformers Animated, which admittedly I never really watched. While the series is a return to form, this is one of the most unique and odd experiences in the entire franchise. This is a mix between a 2D platformer in a sense, but also a puzzle game with 3 different heroes to work with. It's super bizarre, but I'll try and break it down. Our primary heroes we work with are Bumblebee, Optimus, and Bulkhead. Each of them have different roles and abilities. Bumblebee is the only character who can jump and also wall bounce, and his ability to use electricity makes him in charge of powering on elevators. Bulkhead is easily the least interesting, just being able to break the breakable walls and move the occasional obstacle. And finally, Prime has a battle axe, making him a good character against most enemies, plus he can throw the axe along a fixed path. This helps you reach the otherwise unreachable switches alongside grapple through scaffolding. And while somewhat simple at times, it also makes for a decent challenge figuring out where to position the Autobots and how to get them all to the end. But these are the type of games I really don't know how to talk about whatsoever. So if you're interested in the game, it's a pretty impressive DS title, but we've got like 15 more games or something. We don't have time for this. Oh boy, another mobile game I couldn't get my hands on, but this one I'm actually kind of heated about missing out on. This game released a good 3 years after the first mobile game and picks up from that weird Commodore 64 game as the second strategy game on our list. But this one is fucking amazing. If you've ever played Advance Wars, it's pretty similar to that, but with big robots and stupid names. There are support systems for team morale, terrain advantages and disadvantages. When 2 characters start to fight, there are these cool animations of them exchanging blows. It's overall a very cool system. But as with all strategy games, explaining the basic combat itself is pretty useless. It's not like I can tell you to go play the game for yourself because you can't. So I guess play Advance Wars. They still hold up as one of the best strategy games out there. Back to the movie franchise here with the second film that released in 2009, just 2 years after the original. Whereas the original was getting mixed reviews, this movie is largely considered to just be blatantly awful. Most people like myself find the camera work to be unwatchably shaky, and once again, the humans receive just as much attention as the Transformers do, which from a director standpoint, I can sort of understand, but you gotta know your audience. 0 people really care about the humans here, we're just for the giant metal machines. The movie runs for damn near 2.5 hours, and it's one of the most miserably drawn out entries in the entire franchise. But regardless, let's hop into our final game on the PS2. Revenge of the Fallen is a similar but also drastically different game when compared to the original title. Where that game gave you an empty but sprawling world to navigate and find your way through, this game gives you a far more on-rails corridor-based platforming experience. The combat is realistically the exact same, but to my delight, 95% of it can just be entirely skipped altogether by just hauling ass. For some reason, I feel unbelievably fast while doing so, which prompted me more than anything else to just speedily platform through the game. However, this game makes a substantial deviation from the previous movie-based games, being the first game with a unified campaign between Autobots and Decepticons. All of the events play play out exactly as they do in the movies, but sometimes you'll play as Barricade and drive through the city away from the Autobots, and sometimes you'll be the one chasing him as Bumblebee. Okay, hey everybody,
Dagger.
from the future here. It turns out the PS3 and PS2 versions of this game are drastically different. The PS3 version is basically just the original PS2 game, but it's arguably worse than the PS2 version, to be honest with you. But yeah, if you played this game and you're wondering why it looks so different, that's why. But until I died, I never noticed the absolute worst aspect of the game. There is no fucking checkpoints ever. Like, at all. Well, the game's not even that hard, you should never need to blame the dev. Yeah, that's fair until you consider that these cancerous glitches occur which make your cursor locked on the screen, making me restart the Starscream level from scratch 2 separate times. God damn it, fuck this game. Transformers War for Cybertron, the first game in a 3-part series unofficially called the Cybertron Trilogy. These games uniquely take place before the Transformers ever came to Earth, making them technically prequels. These games have their own stories, and gameplay-wise they are completely different from anything we've covered before. The game of course takes place during the War for Cybertron, but not just any war, a civil war between Autobots and Decepticons. The previous Prime of Cybertron, named Zeta Prime, has just died in combat, and the Autobot side of this shows Optimus' rise to power and becoming the Optimus Prime we know and love. There's also a Decepticon campaign with Megatron seeking out the Dark Energon, currently in the hands of the non-Decepticon Starscream. So for fans of the series, there's plenty of story to take interest here, and for the people who are mainly here for the combat, there's a lot to talk about there too. This is a third-person shooter that has a bunch of different gameplay styles. During most of the campaign, you operate as a 3-man squad, taking down enemy forces. But of course, being a Transformers game, there are a ton of different ways they spice up the combat. For starters, by simply pressing in the left stick, you transform into your character's unique vehicle. Megatron in this game becomes a tank, Optimus is a semi, Starscream's a jet, you know the deal. This adds a unique level of freedom to what would normally be a mundane third-person shooter. But unfortunately, this game crashed on me constantly, meaning this footage is partially mine and partially not. Now, thankfully, I played this game when it came out back in 2010, meaning thankfully I'm not completely talking out of my ass. But even back then, the biggest issue this game had was the mixed bag that is the game's visuals. Just watching the game's cutscenes, you will get a drastically skewed idea of what this game looks like. And while these cutscenes are fucking sick, Unreal Engine 3 was relied on way too much here, and the textures and shading just don't mix very well, resulting in a very dry, dull, and dusty aesthetic, which is a massive shame because the effort put into all the redesigned character models is absolutely insane. Megatron has an awesome design based on his appearance in the original cartoons. Even Optimus looks pretty slick here. And holy shit, look at the big dinosaur, man. God damn. I had a giant toy of this guy as a kid, which automatically makes me about 3 to 5 times cooler than you are. Of course, all the designs are cooler except for the vehicle forms. I mean, what the fuck, man? That's not a semi. I've seen PT Cruisers that look better than that. What the fuck? Weirdly, most of the Decepticons have really cool designs, but the Autobots just got absolutely fucked. To wrap up the campaign though, each side fights the giant monster on the other team, Autobots fight Trypticon, Decepticons fight Omega Supreme. While pretty cool in preparing the story for the next game, it's really not what made this game so special all the way back in 2010. That was that this game is the first Transformers game ever with online multiplayer. This is an absolutely insane experience that makes for one of the most rapid-fire, fast-paced experiences I've ever had in a shooter. Think of this as a Call of Duty-like shooter in terms of game modes and objectives, but it's completely fucking insane because everyone's a goddamn Transformer. Sure, when everyone's playing Transformers like Megatron and Optimus it's slow, but when you're in a gunfight and Starscream turns into a jet and flies behind your lines, shit gets pretty fucking crazy. However, the game is reliant on certain characters with high mobility being chosen in my opinion, because if not, there's just way too much space for its own good, and it can go from very, very quick to very, very slow. While it didn't age amazingly, it was an important first step for the sequels the game would get just a few years later. Alright, time for the second iteration of the War for Cybertron games, adapted for the Wii this time. However, over the last few years, I've begun to completely hate the Wii as a console because it started the most annoying trend in gaming history. Useless, unnecessary motion controls that add absolutely nothing to gameplay whatsoever. However, while still frustrating, I'll admit that they're almost tailor-made for this type of game. Transformers Cybertron Adventures is an on-rail shooter that reminded me a shit ton of those Time Crisis games that you'd find at an arcade. You can play as either Autobots or Decepticons, however the idea for both is the exact same. Shoot at the bad guys and follow directions. These games have vehicle segments like any Transformers game should that have you either driving or flying through a set path while dodging obstacles. And while I'm sure on paper that sounds somewhat interesting, there's a very good reason why this game has a 41 on Metacritic, and I'll tell you why. The gameplay fucking sucks. I mean, there are 4 weapons that every single character has. Technically they slightly change, but they all serve the exact same purposes. The vehicle segments give you absolutely zero freedom, and it's more of a gauntlet than it is a race or even a challenge. Every vehicle segment consists of 3 elements: environmental hazards that you can just blast through or ignore, grounded enemies that don't fight back, or aerial enemies that also don't fight back. It's fucking stupid. The only enemies that could kill you if they wanted to are the bosses, which are quite few and far between and spend the entire goddamn time running away from you, meaning there's no suspense or anything to look forward to because you know the enemy just gets to have health and runs away. God damn, this game sucks so bad, man. Whatever you do, do not play this game. It's a waste of time. Hopefully the next few are tolerable. So unfortunately we have 4 games back to back on this list that I could not manage to get my hands on, meaning we're going to be doing a speed round of the next 4 games, some horrible and some mediocre. So yeah, here we go. First we have the For Cybertron DS version of the game, and this is a huge graphical jump in quality. The game attempts to copy the PS3 game scene for scene, but it fails miserably and barely captures the feeling of the original game. The UI is cancer, the enemies look like they're from an Atari, and the movement speed is absolutely fucking horrible. Next game is a mobile game for Revenge of the Fallen, and this time around it's another 2D platformer, but they also forgot to add a video game here. I mean, just watch this. Does this look interesting to anybody here? Next up is Transformers Animated The Chase, and this is one of the most interesting cases on this list because I don't know anything about this whatsoever. This was a Japanese exclusive title, and on top of that, it's an arcade exclusive game, meaning there's almost zero information about it I could get my hands on. Now, what little I do know is that it's a car chase style game where we race through traffic to shoot at a Decepticon. Overall, a shame that I couldn't find a way to play this, but what can I do about it? Finally, we got Transformers Animated The Shooting, which, you guessed it, is also a Japanese exclusive arcade title with no footage of it. So what do I know about it? Well, weirdly enough, a lot more. This game features a way to play as the Autobots or Decepticons, but unfortunately the gameplay is fucking cursed. It's just a very lame arcade shooter where the enemies just slowly walk towards you and do nothing of interest. There's nothing to do with the Transformers here in general outside of the fact that they're robots, so it's just a cheap cash grab. Overall, fuck this game. Transformers Dark of the Moon. Yet another movie tie-in game. Hey everybody, Dagger from the future here. I realized in editing that I completely forgot to talk about The Dark of the Moon as a movie, but instead of just coming up with something to ramble on about that movie, I figured I'd plug somebody who made a very, very well-made video essay on why the Autobots are potentially not the good guys. This dude makes phenomenal video essays, this one is no different. Once you're done here, go give him a watch. The game starts off with a pretty familiar look for these games, and we get our hands on yet another over-the-shoulder third-person shooter. But wait, this one is actually fun? Wait, no, that can't be right. Oh, here we go. Just like the previous entry of the style, Fall of Cybertron, this is a hybrid shooter between vehicle combat and robot combat. But this game in particular looks like fucking horseshit. But from a pure gameplay perspective, this is done miles better than Revenge of the Fallen was. Each character you get your hands on this game has a very distinct array of weapons you can pick, making the robot combat never really feel stale. However, this game manages to kneecap itself completely with the largest overhaul it has, which is for the vehicle combat. Vehicle combat in this game is called Stealth Force for whatever reason, and it almost halves the damage you take from incoming fire, as well as increasing your overall firepower, and giving you mobility. While initially fun and a destructive machine, they made the mistake of making this way too fucking good for its own sake. So guess how often I fought an encounter without using this? Almost never. And since the game prompts you to use one style of combat, I find this game to be very boring. You could argue that I'm a lazy piece of shit and I don't have to be doing this, but you do. The game gets instantly harder, and anytime shit's getting hard, you're going to use this, making it a boring crutch. However, those issues can be completely overlooked in my opinion if you're a fan of the series. The simple fact that you're playing as your favorite characters will definitely make up for it, and you know what? The free driving parts are actually pretty fun. But the biggest issue I have for this game absolutely buries it in my opinion. What does this map and level design look like to you? What do all of these maps have in common? Well, you probably didn't get the answer right, but it's a cramped corridor style design, and every single level has it. It doesn't matter if you're infiltrating a facility, going through a mountain, forest, they are all laid out to where 90% of what you're doing is moving forward. That is until you find a group of enemies, which turns what could be an interesting game into a fucking snooze fest once again. Dark of the Moon DS. You all know the deal at this point. Bad port of bad game means really bad game, right? Yes, correct. But weirdly enough, this is the best game out of all of them. And yeah, this is the final DS port they ever tried, thankfully, and like I said, this one really isn't as bad as the others. I mean, just look at it. The game actually functions without the touchscreen for the most part, and the combat at the very least operates uniquely. And this time we play as the main characters as opposed to a blank slate. However, this game falls into the same unfortunate trap the console version does, being yet another corridor-based shooter. The Autobot title starts with us playing as Bumblebee and introduces us to the gameplay in an admittedly very drawn-out tutorial going over the combat. The cursor locks on extremely quickly, and we have three types of attacks. A light attack, which might as well do absolutely nothing, a heavy attack that uses a scarce amount of ammo, which borderline one-shots an enemy, and then a melee, which, when it decides to work, is probably the easiest option. The combat is almost always present, but thankfully never really the main objective, meaning technically you can skip a lot of it. But if the combat isn't the main focus, what is? Well, the stupid fucking scans you need to complete or other things you need to destroy. I'm not even gonna bother explaining this, but just know it's a pain in the ass. But the one redemption the game might get is in the driving and oh, what the fuck? Who thought this was a good idea? There's not even a turning radius, it's just exclusively cardinal directions. This is horrible. The Decepticon version of this game is, weirdly enough, actually not quite as bad. Starscream talks shit to you the entire time you play the game, and instead of defending shit, you're on the offensive, meaning you can actually rush through the game, which suits me perfectly. The game is once again an identical clone, but you know what? The Decepticon Dark of the Moon game on DS is probably the best DS game in the entire Transformers franchise, but it's still one of the worst games overall, so let's get into something better, shall we? Yes, I know what you're thinking. We just saw this title, but Hear me out. In a genius move, they decided to take a PS3 game that barely functions as it is and put it on the Wii. But the Stealth Force edition of the game is not a simple port of the PS3 game, otherwise I wouldn't have even included it. This is its own beast. As I said earlier, the mechanic that makes Dark of the Moon unique and also horribly broken is called Stealth Force, this game's namesake. And let me explain this game to you. What if we took a mediocre game and then took away half the combat and made it an exclusively car-only combat, removing every other feature? This game is genuinely insulting. What is the point of a Transformers game if you can't transform? This is just very, very poor twisted metal. And the best part is that the controls are still fucking awful. Meaning not only do you have to play the worst part of Dark of the Moon for the full game, but you can barely even aim properly. It's miserable. Objectively, this might not be the worst game on this list, but this is easily my least favorite. It's lazy, boring, and the definition of a cash grab, and I can't even be fucked to talk about it. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, they decided to make a mobile game. Oh boy. Actually, hilariously, the mobile game has a higher review score on Metacritic than the actual movie, so that's something. But due to the fact that it's an old mobile game, all I have to work with are the trailers and the small amounts of gameplay that exists on YouTube, so here's a brief rundown. This game seems like it was a top-down shooter kind of similar to the previous titles, and this game had 3 fairly difficult levels to complete. Since there were only 3 levels here to play, the biggest complaint I saw was the lack of replay value the game had alongside the mediocre combat. And yeah, that's about all the information I could dig up on this particular game, but thank God we are done with Dark of the Moon. I don't know who decided to give this movie 5 different video games, but fucking moron, man. Fall of Cybertron, the direct sequel to War of Cybertron that released just a couple years later. Now, just looking at the gameplay on a surface level, you've probably already picked up on a few things. First is that this looks almost identical to War of Cybertron, and you're 100% correct. Very few models have changed, and it's still Unreal Engine 3, so it looks kinda like shit to be honest. But the game more than makes up for this with its storytelling, and this is absolutely amazing here. War for Cybertron made me feel like it was going from cutscene to gameplay and the two are completely disconnected. This game interweaves the cutscenes into the gameplay, making for a far more smooth experience. All the usual favorites make their return here too. The playable characters range from Optimus Prime to Bumblebee and Jazz, and fucking Grimlock in his first playable experience, which is fucking perfect. You might be stupid, but turning into a literal T-Rex mid-fight is something that will never not be cool, god damn it. The story here picks up from where the last one left off, and it's really just more of the same, but without Trypticon, rest in peace. Megatron wants to fuck shit up, Optimus does not want him to. There's a lot of war and death and violence, and it all wraps up with one big push against the Decepticon forces, culminating with a showdown between leaders, and you won't believe who wins this one. Now, I didn't get to play any of the multiplayer, but I actually played this when it came out, and I can say I enjoyed it a ton. But I was also an idiot back then. What I can tell you is that the game looks largely the same from a quick glance, but everyone says it's better, so I guess I'll take their word on it. But regardless, this is essentially the same game as War for Cybertron, but with a more polished and finished campaign, and while some features like the co-op campaign have been taken out, the game still remains fantastic. But we don't have time to camp on this game, we still have like another 11 to go. Transformers Human Alliance, the final arcade game on our list, and weirdly enough, this one really wasn't half bad at all. Human Alliance is set right in between Revenge of the Fallen and Dark of the Moon, and to be honest, it really doesn't mention anything about the story, so it's not really important. This is yet another rail shooter, except unlike the previous game of this type, Cybertron Adventures, there's no cover mechanics, no selectable weapons, it's literally just a stripped-back version of that game. However, the game more than makes up for it with honestly the most smooth and defined experience that I honestly was not expecting whatsoever. While initially eye-catching, the combat is admittedly sort of mediocre, with one exception I'll get to in a minute. The entire game consists of us sitting in the back of a vehicle, most of the time being Bumblebee, and shooting at various waves of enemies. They don't really do anything of interest, they just sort of transform, mouth breathe for a minute or two, and then die. But the real challenge comes with the boss fights, and let's be honest, this is what we all came for. The first boss fight is against Starscream, and I still can't get over how bad his redesign is, man, holy shit. Starscream constantly attempts to kill us, and we need to shoot back at his weak point. And if you want to get technical, these segments aren't really that good or difficult, they're really just more importantly cool, which is more than half of these games can say, alright? And honestly, if you can find a way to play through this game legally, I would 100% recommend it. It's a very fun time. But now it's time to conclude an era in the Transformers franchise. This game marked the final movie-based video game on our entire list, and to be honest, thank God, man. They are like 1 for 8 on those games. But regardless, it's time we enter a new chapter of endless reboots and indecisiveness. Chapter 4. The Modern Era. After the many war crimes that were the Michael Bay video game adaptations, the license holder, Hasbro, decided to stop making horrible games, and the license to create a Transformers video game has become something far less distributed. But what series are taking over now? Well, unfortunately, the series still hasn't found their footing. Our first series is Transformers Prime, which released initially in 2010, and really it's just sort of a reboot to the whole series, at least I'm pretty sure it is. It's never really explained when this takes place, but it's definitely very different from anything else. Prime to me represents the biggest return to format of any series to this point, and as someone who decided to watch this for the first time here recently, it's actually really fucking good. It does all the things that the original series does, but with a nicer, more modern design. But the Prime series itself got one singular game based on the first season of the show, and this time for the 3DS. Would you believe me if I said this was actually a good video game? This game is extremely similar to all the other DS titles we saw earlier, at least formula-wise, but this game feels like it does perfectly what all those games want it to do. This is yet another third-person shooter slash beat-em-up that makes the combat the main focus of the entire experience, but I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let's talk about the story. Megatron and the Decepticons are hauling a large meteorite of Dark Energon, and Optimus sends everyone in to stop them. This level acts as a general tutorial to get familiar with the combat and the general objectives you'll need to be completing. We can lock onto our targets and fire at them just like any other game of this type, but it goes into far more depth with the melee and adds combos you can do, some having properties like shield breaking and others really just being there for DPS. It's honestly really simple, but very enjoyable. The vehicle controls are actually functioning this time around, and they brought back some features from Dark of the Moon with the ability to shoot while driving. Overall, fantastic stuff. It's important to say that this is incredibly simple, but even so, its smoothness makes it to where it's never a chore to play through, at least in the earlier levels. Optimus shuts down the ship's pulling system, and then we go down to the meteorite to square up with Megatron in our first ever boss fight, and this is where I start to have a couple complaints. With very few minor exceptions, the bosses all follow the exact same patterns. The boss will run around for a bit, shoot at you until you shoot back a couple of times, in which case they'll pull up a shield, and they'll just sit there and wait for you to break it. Outside of a few boss-specific gimmicks, this is literally how every single fight will go. But once we get through that, we start our first proper level playing as RC the motorcycle. We clear through enemies and do the normal gameplay loop until we find Arachnid, who captures Jack, one of the humans that no one really cares about, but we have to give some chase. These chase sequences are okay enough, if a little bit boring since there's not really anything you're expected to do outside of just keeping up with Arachnid. But then we have Bulkhead stage, and to be honest, there's nothing really special here outside of our showdown with Starscream. Starscream flies around just like he does in the Armada games to disorient you, but then he lands on a pillar which we can knock him off of. And then there's Bumblebee's level, which just sucks in general. Overall, Transformers Prime is exactly what the DS games originally wanted to be. While definitely not a masterpiece, it's definitely a lot better than most of the games on this list and made for a very enjoyable experience. Transformers Universe. The series only dip into the shit show that is the MOBA genre of video games, and this one only existed online for no joke, one singular year, from 2014 to 2015. The game allows you to either play as the Autobots or Decepticons in a multiplayer online experience, but you all know the deal. Game doesn't exist anymore, barely any footage of the game online, so I'm talking out of my ass here again. The game got some pretty mixed reviews here and was just cancelled by Hasbro without any real explanation, just that they weren't really interested in keeping up with the game online after a year. There were a collection of game modes like Team Deathmatch, King of the Hill, CTF, the usual stuff for this type of game, but there were also a bunch of different archetypes to pick from, ranging from snipers to tanks and medics. But out of all of the modern games, this is easily the one I know the least about. It seems like it had a pretty horrible release, and to this day they've never attempted another game like this since. But let's move on to the final game of the Cybertron trilogy. This one feels personal. Transformers video games went through some of the biggest ups and downs, never really finding its footing, but it finally did so with the War of Cybertron shit. It had new designs for the younger Transformers and better online gameplay than any other Transformers game. And you know what this game does? It just threw all of that out the window for the sake of a little bit more money for a tie-in. The amazing redesigns for the Autobots have been completely swapped out for the sake of tying in with the movie designs. And what's even more funny is I didn't even bother doing this with any of the Decepticons. They just left them the way they were. But Optimus now looks 1,000 times worse, same with Bumblebee, Jazz, and god damn it, look what they did to Grimlock, man. It doesn't even look like he belongs in this environment. While the jet transformations are still really fun, the other vehicles for some reason have lost all sense of speed. I'm sure you're still going the same speed, but it just looks so slow, I don't know why. And once you're in combat with the vehicles, it seems like an even more dull version from the previous two games. And while the Grimlock levels felt super cool before, he just looks and feels so weirdly different here. And also, whoever changed Soundwave's voice back to the movie version needs to be fired. Outside of the gameplay differences, some of the biggest issues I read online were with the campaign. The story cuts constantly between the Autobots and Decepticons, and this game kind of suffered from the same thing that The Last of Us 2 did. Just like that game does, it cuts at the weirdest possible times. You'll spend 4 missions trying to complete a big push as the Decepticons just to switch to the Autobots and foil their plans, wasting all of your time. It's so confusing. The story is also immensely simplified down. Bad guys have the Dark Spark, we don't like that, we need to stop them. And to be fair, Transformers games and movies have never really been known for their deep and complicated stories, but this is almost completely brain dead. And the multiplayer has also been stripped back. The vast multiplayer environments and crazy fast-paced movement and transformations just kind of feel gone. And I don't even know what to say. They literally took the most amazing adaptation since the PS2 games and said, what if we made another one of those games? But we made it really bad. All they did with these games was take away half the features and revert the designs that made people attracted to these games to begin with. It's fucking baffling. This marked the end of an era, the death of multiplayer Transformers games, and certainly the death of the Cybertronian trilogy. And what a sour note to end these games on, because genuinely these games were regarded as something amazing at one point. From here on though, the frequency of these games dropped drastically and they get a little goofy to say the least. Angry Birds Transformers. What the fuck is this game? I mean, honestly, who decided to make this game? Was it Hasbro or was it the Angry Birds team? Either way, it's just odd. The game is an on-rail shooter in a sense, but a little bit different. We have an array of Transformers adaptations of the Angry Birds characters, each with their own unique-ish abilities that are used throughout the dedicated levels. All the characters have blaster shots to shoot out the pigs, and most of them can't even really shoot you back, except for a couple which need to be focused on quickly, and the game becomes very stale very quickly. The real only threats are the giant towers that try to fall on you that you need to avoid by transforming, and then these enemies that pop up and shoot at you. You barely have enough time to react to these anyway, making them very frustrating. While a lot of people seem to like this game, and I liked it as a kid, I can't say I'm too fond of it these days. Okay, holy shit, we're getting back into the good stuff here. Transformers Devastation, the next beat 'em up in the franchise, and this one is very special as it reverts back to the G1 designs. But instead of adapting them to a more gritty modern design, it keeps everything stock and makes for a very cartoonish design. The game's premise is that a group of Insecticons begin to attack a major city. The Autobots aren't much of a fan of that, so we immediately start the game off, and holy shit, this is literally just Bayonetta, but Transformers. This is a fucking masterpiece. Now, I've never actually played through the Bayonetta games as much as a crime as that is, but the game's combat was still very, very easy to pick up. We have a limited amount of ammo for a range attack, so most of what you're going to be doing is melee, which is also incredibly simple but satisfying with combos that get progressively more powerful. But while the fodder enemies are everywhere, the game absolutely fucking thrives on the large-scale boss fights that it makes the whole focus. Most of these are admittedly pretty difficult, and you're going to have quite a few along the way. Of course, everyone wants to see the big clash between the two leaders, but Starscream, Soundwave, and of course Devastator make for some of the most crazy encounters in the entire series. Now, I'm not going to opine too much on the combat itself because, as I mentioned, I'm not even close to an expert on these style of games, but I can tell you I was never frustrated once. The combat is extremely accessible for people who have never played these types of games, but also reward veterans with high damage combos. This is honestly a pretty short game overall, just kind of being a boss rush towards the end. And while the game has generally mediocre reviews, I think that this is an absolutely great game. If you can catch it on sale, it is definitely worth a playthrough, especially if you're a fan of the Bayonetta games. Transformers Earth Wars. Yet another mobile game, but this time it's a direct ripoff of Clash of Clans. Earth Wars released in 2016 and does absolutely nothing to hide the obvious inspiration from arguably the greatest mobile game ever made. But to the game's credit, it's honestly pretty fun. The normal Clash mechanics are here, but they're very distinctly Transformers. At the start of the game, we get to choose our faction to play as and war against the other side. I personally like the Decepticons way more, so let's go with them. We start the game with just one hero, Starscream, in our attempt to raid enough bases to get Megatron back to Earth. The attack mechanics are really where the game starts to differentiate itself from its cock roots. We attack the Autobot settlement with heroes as opposed to an army of units. These heroes are the mainstay Decepticons that we can unlock in a very unfortunate gacha trope in video games. Purchasable crystals that in the game give you a random hero of differing quality. Despite the obvious pay-to-win scheme they got going on here, the combat itself is actually pretty fun. Jet characters like Starscream take way more damage than some of the tankier characters, meaning you need to strategize a little bit and use each character's special abilities pretty well. This is definitely a game I can recommend to you that anyone can play for free anytime they want. So if this seemed interesting to you, fuck it, get your phone out. Transformers Forged to Fight, the third and final fighting game on this list, and this one being a mobile rendition of a 3D fighting game. And where the other 3D fighting game on the PS1 was this weird top-down style, this settles into a far more familiar camera angle that 3D fighters like Tekken have, making it much easier to digest. The gameplay itself takes place on a campaign map where we have a gauntlet of fights to go through with dialogue from the main antagonist in between. Of course, the main aspect of this game is fighting, and I'm happy to say this isn't too bad at all. Now, fighting games made for mobile specifically have these very, very weird controls that involve swiping, and unfortunately this game also falls for the trope. At close range, you can either tap the screen to throw a light attack, swipe the screen for a medium attack that results in a lot of plus frames, and then a heavy attack by holding down to the right side of the screen, which kind of seems like a Hail Mary. We can block by holding the left side of the screen, but there's some chip damage. But most interestingly for me, there's this huge sidestep you can do by swiping up or down, resulting in a huge opportunity to counter for big damage. The combat is honestly pretty solid overall and resulted in some pretty cool moments in my playthrough. But my issue with this game comes from the once again forced gacha elements, which are just so frustrating at this point. Each character has an associated power level that scales further into the game, making for a very convenient roadblock for the game to throw in your face. Or you can just pay an endless amount of money to make it progress quicker, when easier, and get cooler robots with bigger numbers by their name. It's an obviously predatory system to prolong a decent base game, making this just sort of a mediocre game altogether. Here we go, the end of the road, the very final Transformers game that's ever been released. And out of all the game genres we've been through, endless reboots, horrible, awful game concepts, the series ends on yet another strategy game. Transformers Battlegrounds is a spiritual successor to G1 Awakening, but this game released on consoles and PC, and I am so happy to report that we're ending on a very happy note. This game takes place during a Decepticon invasion, and we play as a human who controls a squad of Autobots. This is absolutely great. Being a turn-based strategy game, there's a lot more differentiation between strategical and tactical moves that you need to prepare for. Playing defense in this game is very important. There's a bunch of different ways you can do it, but mainly by taking cover or choosing your enemies carefully to take better positioning after. The game implements a value system of both your movement and action actions that you take. Each character has 3 tokens per turn. Each token can be used to reposition your character or burn between 1 and 3 tokens to inflict a very powerful attack. There's a bunch of different tactics you can pull off with different strategies. Like, yeah, Bumblebee has an attack range, but Windblade can just fly over those houses and shoot at them and fly away, making it a safe attack. All of this makes for a very fun and entertaining strategy game, but there is one large complaint I have with the game as a whole. As much as I like the game, the sense of controlling a large group of forces from Awakening is completely gone here, because at most you have 3 characters to control, which feels so limiting. My personal favorite part of strategy games is progressing from small battles to grand, full-scale battles being fought on multiple fronts. But this game never really achieves anything like that, and the closest thing that you can get is just another Decepticon leader that you need to take out. Overall, at the price of $25, I'm not so sure I can recommend buying this relatively short game, but there are a plethora of sites that sell keys for this game for like $2 to $3, and if you can get it for that price, this is a great game that I can more than recommend, and this is more than I ever expected from the last Transformers game ever made. Except for the new one that releases in like 2 weeks, but fuck that, I'm not waiting, let's get this video done, fuck it. Chapter 6. The Recap. Oh boy. So we're at the end of our journey, and man has it been a long one. I haven't even started editing this. The Transformers franchise started all the way back at the dawn of home video game consoles. They've made a very large collection of very confused, poorly designed games on every range of console, making 4 video games for 3 different consoles in 2 years. The series then progressed with a collection of PS1 games that never really found their footing. But then out of absolutely nowhere, the first Transformers PS2 game is a borderline masterpiece that came out of absolutely nowhere. The series then went through a very dark era of video games with the Michael Bay movies, where the games became needless tie-in cash grabs that averaged 3.5 video games per movie. The series also had a random renaissance period with the War for Cybertron reboot, which brought new life to a declining series, with a brilliant, fast-paced hero-based shooter with a great story and campaign to boot. And then finally into the modern era, where the series got many various reboots and new ideas got themselves video games. Many of these were actually very, very good. However, Rise of the Darkspark absolutely sabotaged the only good remaining miniseries of the franchise by removing all of the cool designs. The series got infected with a disease called mobile games, which are all horseshit. And then we wrapped up on a tremendous return to form with Devastation and Battlegrounds, 2 series that went back to series roots with fantastic twists. Overall, the Transformers franchise is absolutely fucking miserable. Out of 37 games, only 10 of them were fun, making for a 27% success rate. The franchise seems to be far from dead, but it's slowing down. Beast Wars got horrible reviews. The new video game releasing in October looks like it'll be a mixed bag, but who the hell knows? Maybe we'll get another masterpiece randomly. But let's wrap this video up, everybody. I am so fucking sorry, this took much longer than I thought it was going to. There were a lot of complications to this video and also some big changes to the channel that I need to talk about briefly. So the reason this video was delayed is because the video that was supposed to come out a few weeks ago got completely fucked during recording and editing. After that, I lost all the passion I had for that video and I refused to work on something I'm not passionate in. I know it seems kinda petty, but I feel like if I'm not all in on a project, it's kind of reflected in the way it turns out. But during that little era of frustration, this video idea randomly popped into my head, and it's by a mile the most ambitious thing I've ever done. But despite how painful and dreadful it's been, I have never been more proud of a video in my entire life. And I don't normally do this stuff, but due to the way that YouTube's algorithm works, there is no like set in stone way I can determine that this video does so well, even though I've poured countless hours into it. Sure, I can make a video as good as it gets, but if YouTube doesn't put that video on people's recommended pages, I'm just kind of fucked. And I know it's very stereotypical YouTuber to ask for this, but all the buttons down there, the like, the comment, the subscribe, all of that engagement substantially boosts how YouTube views the video and its algorithm. And I'm just going to be completely honest and shamelessly ask, please like and subscribe this video. If this video does well, ideally I can start making larger videos like this more regularly, more produced content. And yeah, the only way that this video is probably going to do well is if I get likes, subscriptions, and comments. So if it's not too much to ask, just hit some of the buttons down there, help me make this whole YouTube thing work out. But let me briefly talk about the future of this channel really quickly. If this video does particularly well, which I'm praying it does, the channel's going to start to change a little bit. I really like making these drawn out videos that talk about not just the games, but also the entire franchise, its history, all of that sort of stuff. I found it to be really, really fun, and I hope you found it just as interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start uploading these types of videos monthly, but to make sure that there's still a video up every 2 weeks, I'm going to be doing a video that's a bit less effort, but it's still going to be pretty entertaining. Like I have a video game genre tier list that I made, and I thought it was a lot of fun that I'm probably going to post. I have some plans to do some story time stuff where I just kind of sit around and play some games and tell some really stupid, embarrassing, horrible stories. And I know that's not really what this channel was based on, but it's just stuff to kind of tide you over to the next video while also just kind of making a funny bit out of it. But yeah, that's going to do it for this video, everybody. Thank you guys so much for watching. This was an exhausting project, but I loved every minute of it, and I hope you did too. If you played any of these games that I couldn't, please tell me what they were like in the comments. Or if I was just dead wrong about a game on the list, tell me how much of a moron I am. But with that, you all know the deal. Any and all support's amazing, but I will see you all in the next one.